Welcome everybody to another live cast here on the Game Wisdom channel. Of course, I am still Josh Bycer, and we got a great one for you today. We're going to be discussing the importance of video game preservation. It's a topic we've talked about before, and it's one that is always important when it comes to the game industry, and especially about preserving classic game designs. Speaking of which, we have the perfect guest tonight to talk about that. He is from the studio Megacat, who they specialize, Megacat Studios, who specializes in not only making modern retro games, but also making them for classic systems as well as creating and maintaining their own systems and cartridges and whatnot. So they certainly have experience when it comes to the good old days. So please welcome from the studios, Andrew Marsh.
Thanks for having me.
Hey Andrew, it's great to have you back. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. How have you been?
I've been alright. We're in the middle of summer now, so my allergies are at peak annoyance. I guess, do you suffer from any allergies?
Yeah. No, it's going nuts right now. The weather in Pittsburgh has been crazy lately. It's either like 90 degrees or just torrential downpours, one or the other.
But for those of you watching us right now, so I'm just adjusting my headset, either live or recorded, I did a cast with Andrew earlier regarding more about modern retro from the point of view of game design, in terms of balancing and creating the systems. That cast should be going up, I'm hoping before this one goes up in archive form, but we'll see what happens. But, like I said, for today, we're going to be focusing on the act of game preservation. So before we do that, for people who either haven't watched our previous cast or are tuning in now, could you talk a little bit about yourself and what Megacat Studios is?
Sure, yeah. Brief summary is I'm the lead designer for Megacat Studios. What we do is we make games with a retro aesthetic for modern platforms such as the PC or the Xbox One. But we also make games for retro platforms as well, like the NES, SNES, Sega Genesis. And part of what I do is overseeing the technical aspects of the game design to make sure that they'll work on those retro platforms.
Mm-hmm. And as I said a few minutes ago, as we talked about on our previous cast, you guys also know how to do like the soldering and the manufacturing of the cartridges.
Yeah.
It's all done in-house.
Yep, we manufacture all the cartridges for the retro platforms in-house.
Mm-hmm. And again, that stuff is very fascinating. And as we talked about before, what kind of was the, I guess, inspiration for today's cast is that a lot of the stuff when it comes to classic games, be it from a design or manufacturing point of view, is kind of becoming a lost art in a sense, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I guess in terms of beginning our discussion about video game preservation, I guess to start with, I know again we talked about this on our last cast, but what kind of gave you and James, I guess, the motivation to pursue this kind of classic game or modern retro focus?
I think really what it came down to was, James had the idea to start a video game studio, and he was looking at it as what kind of games did he want to make back when he was a kid. And then he met me, and I sort of had the same feeling about it, where when we were kids, we wanted to be making games for those retro platforms. And so, why not do that? Why not make that part of what we do, is actually get to fulfill that a little bit. And on top of that, there's just, like, we're going to be talking about a bunch of, like, ahead of this, there's a lot of physical elements to video games that are going away, and we're trying to do what we can to keep those around.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know we'll probably touch on this later on, but for people watching, do you guys do anything or have any experience with video game emulation? The various ones like MAME, I keep forgetting the name, but those kinds of software that people can also use to emulate games.
Wait, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Do you have any experience with like video game emulation from a software?
Okay, yeah. Do I have experience for it? Yeah, I definitely have experience with it. We have to use that stuff, in the early stages of development, because it would be extremely costly for us to continue making test cartridges and stuff to test games. So it's definitely important for us to have a little bit of experience with that.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Oscar, thanks for coming on. So, as you were just saying, Andrew, it definitely has become a lost art for a lot of cases. Hey, Mister, thanks for popping on as well. But getting back to the topic, when it comes to video game design, as we've said on many of these discussions, I'm sure you've probably had these thoughts as well, Andrew, it's becoming a lot harder to play classic video games. Be it even talking about stuff from 5, 6 years ago of the last generation, it gets harder and harder. Now, while digital has certainly helped in some aspects, there are still lots and lots of games that are kind of, left to the ether for a lot of people to try and find.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. I'm a big fan of classic DOS gaming personally, so there's probably about 2 million games I will never play in my life from that because they're just gone.
Yeah.
They're on a floppy disk in a storage unit somewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, like for myself, the NES and SNES era was what I grew up playing. I missed a lot of classic PC games, and while GOG has certainly been a good option, it's not perfect. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about that probably in its own section in a few minutes. But as you were saying, I guess to touch on what you were just talking about a few minutes ago, Andrew, regarding the idea of like that lost art of dealing with the physical aspects of it, could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Oh yeah, totally. I don't think it matters what kind of retro gaming someone could be into. It could be like PC gaming, console gaming, it doesn't matter. Back in the day, things like a really awesome manual with like game lore and like great art, really cool boxes that they'd come in, all that stuff was part of the experience. Uh, like cool looking cartridges, like cool label art on the cartridge and stuff. That was all part of the gaming experience. In some games, it was necessary. I mean, the original Zelda came with a map, and that was part of the game for a lot of people, was using that. And so that kind of element going away as we move more towards digital platforms. And I think, I think it's worth having an effort to keep it around.
Mm-hmm. Here's a bit of a fun trivia for you, Andrew, and for the folks watching. Do you remember the physical thing that came with the game Star Tropics that people
Oh
had
man,
to use?
I totally thought you were gonna say that too. Yeah, it came with a letter from, was it your uncle or your grandfather?
One of those two.
Yeah, that really didn't bear much meaning in the game until you got to a point where you had to reveal a hidden message on the letter, and so you had to take the physical letter and dip it in warm water to reveal like a code.
Mm-hmm. Good old times.
That's what I'm talking about
Yeah.
right there. You know?
Mm-hmm. And as you were just saying, Andrew, and this is something that we've talked about, I think, several times in previous podcasts, but when it comes to the act of physical versus digital, I think there's certainly a lot more, I think, ownership over a physical copy of a game compared to digital. I'm sure you will probably agree with that.
Oh, definitely. Nintendo can't come bursting into my house and just ripping a cartridge out of my hands. But in a lot of digital platforms now, you're paying for the license to play the game, and you definitely, like, by the letter of the law, have less ownership
Mm-hmm.
over the game in that case.
Yeah. And as you were saying, again, like the physical aspects have certainly been a major attraction, not just to classic games, but even what we see still today with the super big fancy collector's editions.
Oh yeah, and I love, like, guys like Limited Run Gaming, and there's a lot of different groups who are making it their business to do like sweet physical releases of games, and that's
Mm-hmm.
great.
Mm-hmm. I remember, didn't Hotline Miami 2 had an actual like vinyl player, vinyl disc, like special edition with like all the music on it, or was that
Yeah,
another game?
I think it was, which that'd be an awesome album, but yeah, I think it was that. A lot of games, like, there's been a few games now that have done that. We're trying to do something like that soon.
And as I know, when we last spoke, we talked about like one of the big ones back in the day was Blizzard, with all the lore they were packing into their manuals and
Oh
all that
yeah,
detail to expand on their worlds.
yeah, definitely. I mean, that got you more into the game, you
Hmm.
know? I definitely would read them. I might not have read them as soon as I got the game, you know. I would
Hmm.
want to play it, but after a while, I'd just be sitting around and I'd just start reading the manuals.
Yeah. And one of the big things whenever we talk about that move from physical to digital that we always bring up is that when we were first seeing this discussion, people were discussing that it was going to eventually lower video game costs because you had to deal with a physical release and, of course, the manufacturing logistics of shipping them around. But we still see games at the $50 to $60 range, at least in the AAA side. And a lot of people do wonder, do we get any cost saving on our end or on the consumer's end?
Um, I think what really happened there was that the money that they weren't spending on manufacturing
Mm-hmm.
went into the game's budget. They kept the
Mm-hmm.
budgets the same. I remember before the digital platforms really took off, I remember reading some article about how people were really concerned because when the new consoles come out, I think it would have been like maybe the PS3 or PS4, maybe later towards the PS3's lifespan, that they were saying that games were going to go up about 10-20 bucks
Yeah.
for a physical copy of it. And so I think digital platforms like remove that cost for them, but they still spend the same amount of money on the games. It's just that cost got moved into something else.
Mm-hmm. Now, whenever we talk about video game preservation, I'm sure you've probably heard this question many times over, Andrew, but it's one that always pops up. Why do you think there is that appeal for classic games? I know I can play devil's advocate for a second, but for people watching, why should they care about classic games when they have all these brand new games coming out on a day-to-day basis?
The short answer is because the people making the retro games did it first, and they did it just as well or better. um, but they're unique experiences. A lot of it is that they're products of their time too, and like the art and design of them, and it's everything's very like bombastic, and like everyone's got like sunglasses and like ripped up shirts on, and they're just really nowadays like just off the wall fun experiences because of that. And you'll be hard pressed to find like a retro game with kind of a boring aesthetic to it.
Yeah, and since we last spoke, I finally got a chance to play that Bloodstained Curse of the Moon.
Oh yeah, I haven't even had a chance. How was it?
I really liked it. It just feels like I'm playing a Castlevania game that was released this year.
Yeah, no, I'm like I really want to play it.
Hmm. And as you said, it can be a lot of fun just like trying to go back, and the design does feel like the best examples of retro game design have a great feel to them. Be it something like Castlevania, Mario, or even what we're seeing with modern retro stuff like Locomolito.
Yeah, and in some cases, like you brought up Castlevania, the feel of that game isn't as tight, but that was by design, so
Hmm.
it doesn't feel wrong to you.
Yeah.
Like your character was supposed to be kind of clunky.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's a really good point there. That I know when I spoke with Abile, the publishers for Locomolito's games, that we talked about trying to understanding the difference between that great feel and just dealing with the limitations of the hardware back in the day. And I know we spoke about this on a previous cast, but there's a big difference between making a classic game that has all the warts and frustrating elements of the old days versus one that gets the elements right. And as Oscar was saying in chat, the exact same thing, that when it's done right, it has a very tight form of game design.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that's really the main point is you have to when you're trying to do that, you have to look at retro games that do get it right. Because I'm not going to say they all did. That would be insane. You
Yeah.
know, I played Cheetah 2 before. That game's terrible. Um, but the games do it right. Like a game like Ninja Gaiden.
Hmm.
Like that's when it comes to the NES, that's like my lexicon. You know, that's what I look at when I'm trying to look for good examples of how to do something from a technical perspective. Is that game?
Mm-hmm.
And so Oscar's getting it right there.
Yeah.
Is you look at what worked back then, what didn't work. You get rid of the stuff that doesn't work,
Yeah.
and you take what does work and look at modern examples of it and figure out a way to modernize that gameplay to make it still feel like the old school style, but has modern elements to it.
Mm-hmm. And Oscar's the one who got me interested in Locomolito too.
Nice.
Yeah, but yeah, as you were saying, there, and as and I we talked about as well on our Discord channel, that a lot of the games like modern retro, for some people it seems like, an easy target. Just take a game like Cheetah Man, take a game like Mario, put it together, to get it done very quickly, and you have a classic game. But the best examples are those that take that and run with it.
Yeah, no, if you're just trying to make, Super Mario Brothers 1,
Mm-hmm.
expect a lot of bad Steam reviews,
Yeah.
It's a great game, but it's not a great game that I would buy as a
Mm-hmm.
modern game, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ukulele, I haven't had a chance to play it
Me
yet,
neither.
but from what I heard is they just took the Banjo-Kazooie playbook and just kept it in place, and
Mm-hmm.
it didn't turn out to be the most interesting experience because of that.
Now, here's a very interesting question, like from that last statement and what Oscar was saying about ukulele, that there is a difference between playing a modern game that is just copying those elements, like with ukulele, versus going back and playing a game like Banjo Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day or Mario 64. And I'm going to ask this to you, Andrew, and as well to the chat, and for anyone watching this recorded in the future. Why do you think people are more, I think, accepting of buying a classic game, whether it's on, the NES Classic Edition, GOG, the retro remake, stuff like that, versus playing a game that just simply copies those elements and, throws in, next generation or AAA graphics today?
Um, I think, you know, nostalgia definitely plays a
Mm-hmm.
part in that. um, for sure. But they're also products of their time, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to judge a game made in 1986 the same way you're going to judge a game made in 2018. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I'm more willing to accept,
Mm-hmm.
Castlevania's clunky controls because they came out back then.
Yeah. And I think I would agree with that as well. As you just said, when I'm playing I can't really complain about weird graphics or a confusing goals when I'm playing a game from the NES era. But if I'm playing your game that was designed in 2018 and was just released a few months ago, then yeah, I can certainly complain that your UI makes no damn sense, or what the hell am I supposed to do in your game?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, at this point, what's the excuse?
Mm-hmm.
Just saying that you're trying to stick to retro really doesn't cut it because that doesn't make it a good decision.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really good point. I know that's one we talked about previously, and one for those of you watching we brought up as well. That just saying your game is retro is not an excuse to have those bad elements. Because as we just said, the best examples will iterate and smooth those out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, you're still trying to make a good game, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah. Now, I guess as a bit of a fun question for you, Andrew, and for the chat, besides again what we just mentioned with Bloodstain, I know we brought this up on our previous one, but what are some examples of modern retro games that you do enjoy?
Shovel Knight's always the go-to for me and everybody in history.
Yes.
It's just that's the one that did it 100% right to me. They took that retro feel and modernized it enough and made it feel really good to play.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited for Ion Maiden. I think that's gonna be something else. Um, Especially because, like I said, I'm real into old school PC gaming. So
Yeah. Have you had a chance to play Dusk yet?
No, I really want to. I have like no time to play video games anymore.
I
That's
know.
why retro games are great for me because I can play one in an afternoon.
Hmm. It's the curse of working in the game industry for those folks watching us right now. We're talking about video games all day long, but we can't play them. It's
Yep.
the Twilight Zone surprise twist at the end. But getting back to the topic about video game preservation, I'm trying to think, like, I have several things I want to talk about. I'm trying to think what is the best order. I guess, I guess one thing that I want to touch on, that only we talked about last time, what do you think about GOG, Andrew? In
Um,
terms of, like, from a service standpoint or what it does?
so I never was brave enough to venture into their client, so I can't talk about that.
Hmm.
But what they're doing, I mean, that's great. They're definitely leading the charge on preserving old games, you know.
Hmm. Now, I don't think you and James Hall have too much experience with this part because you guys obviously made your own original classic games. Actually, this is a good point just to reiterate what we talked about last time. Since you guys are releasing games on classic consoles, again, NES, NES, Genesis, for people watching us right now, you guys don't have to deal with any trademark or copyright issues when it comes to releasing games on those older consoles, right?
Ah, right, yeah. All of that hardware and stuff is the patents are expired on them, and it's not really worth the money to renew those patents every time, you know.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, there's really no legal hiccups with that because it would just cost them more to renew that than it would to just keep it around.
And as you said on our previous cast, people are still obviously making secondhand peripherals for these classic systems. And as long as they're not like trying to directly compete or directly model themselves after the original stuff, the console manufacturers pretty much let it go.
Yeah, definitely. Hyperkin's a great company that does that. They have a lot of really cool products that they put out. They have a laser mouse for the SNES, which is like really neat.
Nice. But the previous topic that I want to touch on, which again, I don't think you guys have too much experience with this, but it's still a major part whenever we talk about video game preservation, is dealing with the copyright or IP ownership. And this is one that, for people who just play video games, is not something that you generally have to deal with. But whenever you're trying to work with a classic license or a classic IP, it is certainly a nightmare. I know when I spoke with GOG, they talked about some of those horrors. Farsight Studios with a pinball arcade. At the
Oh
time
man.
of our recording, they are about to lose their licensing contract for a lot of their major tables, and they're
Yeah.
not able to renew that. So those tables are not going to be available for purchase. And even for myself, I just finished writing the manuscript for a book on video game design. So I had to hunt down developers and publishers who have
Mm-hmm.
old copyrights to try to
Mm-hmm.
get their requests. In some cases, I couldn't find the person.
I could imagine that the legal team for Good Old Games
Hmm.
has a very busy job.
Hmm.
Um, they're like I said, some of those games out there are just on a floppy disk in a storage
Yeah.
unit, along with all the licensing agreements.
Yep. Hmm.
Like some of these people just aren't around anymore. Like you just to be able to keep to be able to release those games and maintain releasing them must be a lot of work.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I know a few horror stories. I know No One Lives Forever, that classic PC FPS. That one's kind of, lost in purgatory right now. And I remember when I spoke with Farsight about one of the tales that caused them the most trouble to get the licensing for, which I guess, in a very bad case of irony, was, or serendipity, the Adams Family pinball table and all the different licensing that went with that one. And
I bet.
it is just a lot of trouble. And taking this back to our topic at hand when it comes to video game preservation, it's one thing that causes a lot of issues with maintaining these games. And as a very sad example, you mentioned a few minutes ago the difference between physical and digital, and that when it comes to physical, you don't have to worry about the company coming and taking your copy. But we have seen examples of this on the digital side, with games being either removed from stores or being altered due to licensing agreements running out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, right, that's the second point. That's kind of just a symptom of the times we're in. I don't see that ever really changing. It's the idea that video games are never done being made now. You can always change something, and I mean, yeah, those kind of agreements will certainly expire and not be worth renewing, and so those changes have to be made. I mean, your hands are tied there. And I don't really ever see that changing from how it is unless we stop letting people patch games.
Yeah. Or we have to come with a new legal or contract agreement when it comes to updating these titles. Because as you said, these games are never truly finished.
Yeah, no, and oh man, that is like an extremely nuanced conversation if you want to have it.
And it's one that I think it's only going to get harder and harder, especially as more games are going to the digital front. I mean, obviously we've gone that way for the last decade, or a little bit less than that. But once we see, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with whatever our next console cycle is going to be.
Yeah, I'm pretty interested. Someone just asked me what I was most excited about for E3, and I said to see how the next Xbox and PlayStation pan out.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at as well, because we were talking about this. I know there's a news piece from the Ubisoft head who said that probably this is going to be the last year of us being on this console cycle, or we're going to have one more big console cycle, and then he feels that we're going to go to just streaming as like the future from there.
They're trying. I mean, man, you remember OnLive?
Yeah. Remember, why do I forget their name? The one that Sam and Max from Telltale was originally on. Game.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I don't remember the name of it. You're right.
Yeah, exactly. Let me see.
But yeah, they've been working on making this happen for a while. I mean, look at how wildly popular Netflix is.
Let's see. Can I look it up? Oh, here it is. Game Tap. I think that's what was put on.
Yeah, Game Tap. Forgot about Game Tap.
I think a lot of people did as well.
Yeah, a lot of those early streaming services didn't do so hot.
But yeah, as you were just saying, like Netflix has certainly been a major push towards the idea of streaming shows, and of course a different form of releasing them as well, because as anyone who's watched Netflix knows, when they put up a new season, you don't get them once a week. You get the entire season all dropped in your lap right then and there.
Yeah, I mean, you better believe that Sony and Microsoft are thinking that they want to be the Netflix of video games.
I mean, I spoke with the company Jump, who's trying to position themselves at that with just doing all streaming for their video games. And yeah, it's a very interesting idea. It's one that could change how we buy and sell games, especially when it comes, again, back to digital versus physical. Because I'm sure you remember, I'm sure the audience does as well, the whole issue when Xbox One came out and they were originally positioning it to be stream only, or I'm sorry, digital only for its releases.
Yeah, and I don't know how I feel about the whole situation. I mean, it's definitely starting. If we want to start from that and like the history of all this, then it's all coming from a place of wanting to curb used game sales.
Yes.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah,
I've definitely been poor before. Like that. It happens.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. If it's coming from the same place that was, where they're just trying to stop people from selling used games, then I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't like that.
Yeah, I think that's another topic we could easily jump into there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as Oscar just brought up, I think this will probably be a good time to talk about software emulation for at least a little bit. one of the big aspects, at least from the PC side, in terms of video game preservation, has been the numerous system emulation or system emulators that have been released over the years. I know I've played one for the NES and SNES, which may or may not have been completely legal. There's, of course, the big one for, I believe it's GameCube or Wii, the Dolphin.
Yep.
And I'm sure you probably know a lot more emulators than I do, and I'm sure so will the chat. So, when it comes to software emulation, this is its own very tricky topic, not only from a legality point of view, but also from a performance. I think we may have touched on this a little bit on our previous casts, but what has been your experience with software emulation of these systems?
I think that first off, this is a pretty interesting topic for us to talk about because I am in a business that sells retro platform games, and so it definitely is something we need to think about a lot. And yeah, so from a performance standpoint, I would say some of them are really good. There's like some SNES ones that are pretty solid, and really the goal is always to have cycle accurate emulation, make it 1-to-1 to the console.
Yes.
And that's extremely hard to do. So there's definitely inconsistencies. I feel like it's getting to the point where those inconsistencies are getting really hard to see unless you're like us, because we develop for the platform. But I mean, it's getting pretty. They're doing a really good job on preserving how that stuff works.
Now, here's a question for you, and this is one that I kind of know a little bit of the answer to, but again, with your background with doing this on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure you know this a lot more than I do. But when I did like some looking up, and I asked some people I know who do work on video games about software emulation, they point me to an article that discussed some of the advanced or some of the unique challenges to it that the consumer may not know about. I remember one thing that stuck out to my mind was kind of like the timing of trying to get things to work. So I guess I'm sure this could probably fill like 30-40 minutes easily if we wanted to. What are some of the challenges when it comes to software emulation that the general consumer may not know about?
We can keep this pretty short. I'll tell a little story. The timing thing that you brought up is like a huge one. That's something that not a lot of people think about, but the all the chips on that board for the console have their own timing, and you have to get that right. What ended up happening to us was we were developing our game Creepy Brawlers for the NES. It's sort of like a boxing game, like sort of Punch-Out style game. And what we found is that the timing on NES emulators was incorrect on a certain chip compared to what we were using for the board. It wasn't even compared to the actual console. It was one of the chips we were using. There was a timing inconsistency.
And for people watching or listening to us right now, Andrew, when we refer to timing, what are we talking about?
I mean, we're literally talking about the cycles the chip's going through and how long does that take? Like and getting that timing down right was crucial for that game we were working on because it was a RAM actually that was handling some of the graphical things that were going on the screen, and if that timing didn't match up right, it would cause a ghosting effect on the player.
And whenever we talk about timing like this, it keeps reminding me of when I played a Shenzhen IO from Zachtronics that had you manufacturing hardware and trying to get the timing of all the chips down. But back to the topic at hand, like again, this is something that it doesn't sound like from a consumer point of view to be that big of a deal. But as you say, I am sure people who do follow this stuff watching us know this kind of timing is kind of the difference between really great software emulation and the terrible ones.
Yeah. Even in the case of good emulators, it's hard to get that right. I mean, the emulator we were using is, the best NES emulator out there, and it still had. We actually used a couple different ones, and none of them had that timing just right, and so that led to an issue that once we made a physical copy of it, there was a problem in the game that we would not be able to see in emulation.
And I guess here's a question for you: how do you like actually like check or correct that when you're obviously going from the software emulation to actually making the physical cartridge?
In the case of Creepy Brawlers, we made a test program where we could adjust. It just had values on a screen, and we could adjust values until the cycle timing fell within an acceptable range, and then we just used that value.
Mm-hmm.
So
And,
we had to like work around it on a software side, basically.
mm-hmm. And obviously, when you're working in hardware, and this is one thing that a lot of modern games don't really have to deal with too much, that if you make a mistake or when you get to the actual physical construction, it's not that you can actually patch your own cartridge there.
Yeah, that's the
Mm-hmm.
nothing more nerve-wracking than release day, you know?
Yes.
Like if that goes out, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess another part of that, I'm trying to think. I just had a question in my head. I think I just lost it. When it comes to here's the thing. For people watching us right now, again, to clarify, when you're building the hardware or the classic version of your games, you are actually using software that was used, back in the late 80s or into the 90s for these respective systems, right?
Um,
Or
are
a
you talking about
version of it.
you're talking about the physical side of
Yeah.
things? No, for the physical side of things, we can use modern
Okay.
stuff. I use like a modern chip programmer, and I mean the actual physical chips themselves are old because they stopped making them. But
Yeah.
other than that, yeah, it's yeah, I use mostly modern stuff for that.
That actually brings me up with another quick question. I'll get to Oscar's question in a second. As we said earlier, and as we talked about previously, the companies who used to manufacture this stuff, they've probably moved on. They're no longer in business. So, how do you and like other retro or non-retro developers kind of deal with the fact of making like physical versions of these chips today?
There is a great development community out there, and you know, we're active in it. We've worked on some of the software side stuff. You know, we've done some pushes to GitHub on like the software end of things, and there's people just as smart that have figured out PCBs and all that stuff. So there's just a really good invested community that is trying to keep all that stuff alive.
Mm-hmm. And getting to Oscar's question, again, with the fact that you're doing physical releases, do you do playtesting? And if so, how do you manage that?
The way it usually goes down is early on in development, I would say probably up through like maybe the first 50 to 75% of development. Unless there's like a special circumstance that we want to check, we just do it with emulation. And then once it gets to a certain point in development, then we'll switch over to doing mostly hardware testing. And that's all we do with that is we take one of the circuit boards that we put the games on. We have sockets in it. Just pop the chips, burn chips, put them in sockets, and use it on a console.
Mm-hmm. All right. And now this is another question I know we asked last time, but how long does it normally take you to fit a cartridge and make it ready to go?
Like how long does it take to build one?
Yeah.
I'd say from like soldering to the boxed effort doesn't take very long. It only takes 20 minutes. You know, if you got everything in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to software emulation for a second, again, as we said earlier, it's kind of operates that morally or legally gray area. So I was just wondering, again, as someone who does make use of it on a day-to-day basis, what do you think about the case for software emulation as making it more of a legal alternative? Because I know various groups, I think the, what was it? Not the ESA, the other one, I think EFA, they've been talking about trying to use emulation as an alternative for game preservation and making it a legal form because there just aren't any other ways of playing some of these games sometimes.
I think that is an incredibly tricky subject with a lot of different aspects to it. I think that there's a fine line you got to walk there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can say we're trying to preserve Super Mario Brothers, but Nintendo still sells that on all their consoles.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, you are, you know, sort of distributing something that they're actively selling.
Yeah.
And but in other cases, I see it as a reasonable and important thing to do. I mean, there was definitely the source code for Prince of Persia. Did you remember reading about that? Some dude just
No.
some dude just found it in his closet on a floppy disk.
Oh.
And,
Huh.
and yeah, so yeah, that's like important to get off of a floppy disk in somewhere, you know?
Yep. And again, as you were saying earlier, sometimes that just happens. Like the stuff gets just like lost to time. Wasn't there another game that was found like, and like they sent it to like the developer or the publisher or something like that, or
Was it?
was it just Prince of Persia?
I feel like there was like a version of NBA Jam or something that someone found,
Could have
like
been.
some like early beta revision or something of it that someone ended up finding. That happens all the time, actually. A lot of people will just find prototypes of stuff and beta versions of games, like just in storage. That's why I said a floppy disk in a storage locker. That's what I end up finding them. Um, but yeah, so I think there is a place for it for sure. I mean, if it's really a case of that game going away forever or being preserved, then yeah, preserve it. And I think there should be a bigger discussion on a statute of limitations and how long does it take for someone to consider it to be like in that situation. Because I mean, we make games on retro platforms, and you better believe people ask me about ROMs, and I'm like, look, man, it's a little bit different for us, you know. We're actively developing and selling these games. This is our livelihood, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do think there needs to be a broader discussion on like statute of limitations and things like that.
Especially as we talked about earlier, with a lot of even digital games going away and not being able to be found or played anymore. For people who've watched me before, we've talked about EA and how they have turned off servers for many of their games, be it sports titles or strategy games. And when that happens, you can't play those games anymore because you can't even connect to the servers to download the patches you need to keep those games running.
Yeah, no, I don't really like that. I think Star Wars Battlefront 2, oh my God, when people brought that one back, I was so happy. It was so sad not to be able to play that game anymore.
Yeah. Now, here's another question going back to software emulation. This is something I remember reading about in the article, but in terms of like modern computers who are able to run the software, is it true that it gets basically the amount of processing or the actual computer needed to run it gets more and more strenuous the more modern the console you're trying to emulate?
Uh, Not necessarily. Um, that's another thing where it depends. It depends on how accurate you're trying to get it. Um, like look at something like Dolphin that can run on some pretty mid-range computers these days. Um, I have a pretty powerful computer, and sometimes I have trouble running a cycle-accurate Sega Genesis emulator. So it really depends on how accurate it is, you know. In Dolphin's case, they definitely have done some workarounds.
Oh. As a correction from earlier, I looked up the other company. It was the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF. They were
Mm,
the one who was arguing for it, while the ESA was kind of arguing against that.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, with software emulation, as you said, there's a lot of legal gray area, especially when it comes to companies who are still using these properties in some way, shape, or form, versus the ones who are no longer in business. And even going further than that, we can even bring GOG back into the mix, as they have the licensing to digitize or uh, keep these games supported and being sold today. And it can get very hard when we're discussing things, especially when it comes to the value. And I think this is a good topic. We could probably spend a few minutes on. Let me do a quick time check. Yeah, we're about 45 minutes in. But there's definitely another really interesting discussion about what the value is of these games. Now, obviously, like for people who own them and play them, it's the value of being able to enjoy. But for people who own the IP or have somehow got it after how many company acquisitions, there's definitely a discussion about just what value there is in keeping these games supported. And I want to get your thoughts on that one, Andrew, because again, it can be a very tricky topic when we're talking about consumers versus the actual owners.
Do you mean like monetarily, like what's the value of it, or just
Yeah,
like what?
like,
Yeah, like what you're getting for your money.
yeah.
Um, I think there's value in it in the sense that the history of game design and just video games in general is worth experiencing. It's something. It's like films or movies. It's like films or books or music. It's something that people have had enjoyment out of since its inception and continues to do so. And I think playing any game from any era is worth doing. You know. So I think that's really where the inherent value is that people crafted these experiences to entertain people, and it doesn't stop being entertaining just because it's old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the popularity of modern retro games, and even just going back to playing these older games today via GOG, emulations, and so on and so forth. That you really can't put a price on being able to experience something like Castlevania 3, or, the original Sid Meier Civilization, or, again, name any other classic game you can think of there. And I think that, this is a topic right here that could probably fill its own cast. Get that kind of information, that kind of historical value, I think is kind of lost on modern consumers today. Because there are a lot of people who treat video games as, disposable hardware. I buy the game, I play it, and then when the next version comes out, who gives a crap about what I just own? Get the newest and shiniest version of a game.
I think there's definitely some of that, and I think there's some of that in all of entertainment. Yeah. There always has been, and it's just, I think it's how it's marketed. Mm-hmm. I think that especially video games went down a path with their marketing since the early days, and hasn't been able to get itself out of that to where the games are being marketed to people like that. And if it was like I said, we still have that in movies. People still get marketed that the newest movie coming out this summer is the best thing they'll ever see, and who cares about everything else? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's just the way the marketing is for entertainment in general sort of pushes people to think that way.
Mm-hmm. And there's always that modern stigma that stuff being made today just doesn't hold up or isn't as support as it was back in the day. And I know we certainly brought this up on our previous cast, but like a NES cartridge, that thing is very durable compared to a CD or a Blu-ray today.
Yeah, no, let's you want to talk about just physical value, then yeah, my copy of Super Mario Brothers will last forever, but I can walk into your house and just kick your hard drive out of your computer, and you just lost all your video games.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, Oscar. And yet, it's very interesting about that, because when it comes to trying to put a value on video games, that's another hour topic right then and there. And it's very hard to convince people to go back to playing these games, be it from a graphical standpoint or even from a gameplay point of view. Because as we were saying earlier, a lot of classic games have warts to them. Some of them were just inherent due to hardware limitations. Some of them were just due to designers not really figuring things out or just figuring them out as they go along. Like, I bring up XCOM as a good example. It may be one of the best games ever made, but that UI was rough to go back to a play. Or
it's not an easy game to play these days.
Yeah.
No, I definitely agree with that. I think part of it is that we're just video games are under the umbrella of the entertainment industry for sure, but we're the youngest we're the youngest group. We haven't been around as long as everyone else, and we're just sort of going through the same growing pains everything else does. I think once the industry's been around long enough, I think people are going to start to realize, like, more people are going to start to jump on board with the whole video games as art thing. More people are going to feel about it that way, and that's going to help with that a lot. I think that's going to calm people down from, that looks like Oscar said, that looks like a PS2 game, it sucks.
Now, I also brought a really good point regarding remastering games. Ooh, my voice is starting to go. 1 second. But one thing that we've seen over the last few years have been developers taking classic IPs and either bringing the game back one to one or just designing a completely brand new game in that specific franchise. A good example that we just heard about was Battletoads is coming back. We mentioned, of course, Bloodstained a few minutes ago or earlier in the cast. And I guess, what do you think about the idea of remastering these games versus just bringing them back, one to one from the classic point of view, or even something like DuckTales that got a remaster a few years ago?
I would say I'd prefer the remasters over if someone were to release DuckTales just the NES game and DuckTales remastered. I'd buy DuckTales remastered every day of the week. I wouldn't say that it would be remaster versus preservation, Oscar. In this case, I'm talking about someone just straight up selling like DuckTales 2 with nothing to it, but the game still exists, But yeah, I would probably go with the remaster every day because it's a chance to take something that was already really good and modernize it a little bit.
Now, this could be a very meaty question. It's one that's very important to talk about when it comes to game preservation. And that is on who is actually doing it. Now, for the longest time, we've always assumed, or at least back in the old days, that the major companies would keep these games supported, be it Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, and so on. But, as we've seen over the years, and as consoles and hardware have evolved, they are becoming less likely to be the source of game preservation. Of course, Sony famously said that, I think it was from PS3 to PS4, or could have been even PS2 to PS3, that it was just no longer in the cards or being viable to keep those older consoles being emulated or having that backwards compatibility. And of course, right now, over a few months ago, Nintendo announced that they will not be bringing the Virtual Console from the Wii and Wii U to the Nintendo Switch. And this is a very sticky subject to talk about in terms of who should be maintaining these games. Because as we were just discussing, the whole argument over games as art, I think, is kind of layered on when we have this topic. But what do you think about that in terms of, who should be the controller of being able to play these older games?
I think ultimately the publishers should eventually take that on. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Like I said earlier, this is a young industry. I think we all have some things to figure out about how it should work, and I think eventually that we will have to hold them to that. Because again, look at movies. The studios, it's up to them to keep those around. And I think ultimately that's what's going to end up having to happen. But I think there's going to be a lot that we have to figure out. And in the case of Sony, what you were saying, I know something like hardware emulation would be a nightmare to keep going forever. Those are all different computers. That's why the launch PS3 was so expensive, because it had a PS2 just shoved inside of it. So that, and especially now they've changed the kind of processors they use. They're now more like a conventional PC as opposed to what they were using before, and so like all these games would have to be like retrofitted to different architecture, and so it would be difficult to do hardware stuff for sure.
Yeah, and I remember from our previous cast when we were talking about kind of getting MegaCat games to work on PC or modern software versus when you do the retro play or retro construction, that you sometimes have to adjust how things work from our modern PC versus the older ones.
Yeah. I know for us, we make PC games from the ground up. We don't just drag over a Sega Genesis game and make it work on a PC. That would be insane.
Yeah.
I mean, there'll be some circumstances where maybe it's worth it, but if it's a big enough game like Coffee Crisis or some of the other stuff we were working on right now, Logjammers being another one, that stuff is just worth making a PC version for the PC because we can do more with it. In the case of Log Chambers, that's an NES game. I could do something much nicer than an NES game on a PC, you know?
And Oscar was asking, what do you think about Wonder Boy Dragon Trap that lets you switch the graphics and music on the fly? So he says it's kind of like a remake that also includes the original in that case.
Yeah, so that's a tough one for me to answer. That is a very good question, Oscar, because there's one side of me that like, oh, that's kind of BS. They're just doing exactly what I was saying, is releasing something that would be been acceptable 30 years ago now and passing it off as acceptable now. But at the same time, I'm totally the person that would buy that game. So the first thing I said doesn't really make any sense when I say it. I saw that at PAX East and I was like, that's the coolest thing ever. So
now, another part about video game preservation I want to touch on, this one may be a little off topic, but the idea of, as we've said, putting a value on some of these games, that for people who sell like original copies, they will usually mark them up like 3 to 5 times the original costs. And I've seen people like try to sell like Super Mario World for like $200 and stuff like that. And I think that's one of the very weird things, because on one hand, you're trying to make a market out of these classic games, but the other, it just makes it very hard to appreciate them. And I think this is one of the big impetuses for GOG, that suddenly you could buy these games and not spend 10 times a markup on trying to find these older games.
Yeah, for sure. Now you're speaking my language now. This is what I spend all my money on.
Yeah.
What little I have, I spend it on this. Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I certainly get pretty indignant about it sometimes. I'm not going to spend $30 on a copy of Contra, That's insane. Because I always look at it this way. If someone's selling me a game for a lot of money, like, an old retro game for a lot of money, then if it's rare, that makes sense to me. It costs a lot because there's not a lot of them out there. But when someone's just sort of doing it, like in the case, like I would always argue Contra's kind of this case where someone's selling it for $30. People are selling it for $30. Like that's sort of the market value for that game. And it's just because it's Contra and people spend $30 on it. And but when you think about it, like think about back in the day, everybody had a copy of Contra. Yeah. Everyone and the mother had one. That's not a rare game. There's thousands and thousands of them out there. So that's sort of, I think, where things get a little wiggly is when people start pricing things that way and get away with it, because then that sets the market value.
Now, I guess we're going to probably begin to wrap things up, because I'm starting to run out of questions. I'll throw things over to you as well in a second, Andrew. For people watching us live right now, if you have any more questions regarding video game preservation, or even the work done by Megacat Studios on whether it's design or manufacturing, please get them in now in the next few minutes, because this will be kind of like our last call for general questions. But one thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is one that again gets back to that very sticky or very morally gray topic when it comes to game preservation, is having a third party handle it. We brought up GOG earlier in this cast, who are still kind of the gold standard for this kind of stuff. But I guess, in your opinion, Andrew, do you think we'll ever see a third party equivalent for console games? Or do you think that may just be too much of a legal quagmire to jump through?
I think having a unified one would be a huge problem. Like having one that like you could play like original Xbox, PS2, and like N64 games on would be probably asking a little too much, but because those companies would never want to do that. But if we talked about like how Nintendo wants to pull the virtual console, if they outsourced that would be amazing.
Yeah,
like just took that weight off of their shoulders, let someone else handle it. Yeah, that'd be great. I think even if it got to the point where each of them did that, and that'd be reasonable. And then the only sticky part of that is that they would then be looking to do more than just their IPs. and that gets a little
Oh
funky
yes.
because then like someone gets the exclusive rights to Pitfall, and now you have to have an Xbox One to play it.
Hmm. Yeah, I would love to see, like, the dream would be like GOG to be able to put like NES games on the PC. But yeah, that's definitely more a monkey's paw wish than anything else right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oscar asked in chat, what's the minimum viable quantity in order to make a physical release?
Like one of our games, it depends. It depends on what the budget of the game was. That's something we sort of figure out on a game by game basis when we're budgeting for it.
Hmm.
What we'll do is we'll figure out, you know, what we plan on spending on the game, how many copies at one of our general prices would break even at that point, and then we would do an analysis of it.
Now, here's a question. This may be either a fun or not so fun question for you, Andrew, but in terms of the physical side of the manufacturing, the logistics, shipping, and stuff like that, what is, I guess, the most fun aspect of it, and what's the part that is just like the most frustrating or annoying thing to do for you guys?
Um, I'd say physical manufacturing for both those questions. Physical manufacturing can be one of the most fun things to do because you get to make something. That's awesome. Making things is always a rewarding experience, but sometimes they don't work and you don't know why. So that becomes pretty frustrating. You like start spending time of your day troubleshooting something, and you're just like, why can't we just sell these on the internet?
Or as we talked about last time, why isn't there just like a button on Unity that just says convert to Genesis?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
do
Yeah.
it right there.
Yep.
It's right next
So,
to the multiplayer button, folks, for those of you watching this
yeah,
right
that's
now.
right. Yeah. Yeah, no, so it can be really rewarding, it can be really frustrating too.
Hmm. But going back to what we were saying earlier regarding kind of like the allure of owning a physical copy, I always love, as we were saying, having the different colors for the cartridges. I remember,
Yeah.
and here we get to play old man time again for those of you watching. I remember, of course, the gold cartridge for Legend of Zelda, red cartridge for, I think it was Maximum Carnage.
Yep. And Doom.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Wasn't there a green cartridge for a game?
I think so. I don't remember which one though.
I guess, are there any other like obscure ones that come to your mind, Andrew?
Baby Blue, that Wisdom Tree Baby Blue NES cartridge. That's one. I think
Nice.
Codemasters did gold cartridges.
Hmm.
Like all the unlicensed guys,
I don't think Battletoads wasn't a green cartridge.
Now, so any licensed NES game was gray, except for
Hmm.
Zelda. Zelda
Yeah.
got to be gold. Everything else was gray.
Hmm.
But when you start getting into the unlicensed guys, like what Atari was doing with their fake company,
Hmm.
and Codemasters and Wisdom Tree, they all had their own Color Dreams. They all had their own cartridges, and they were all different colors and stuff.
I just remembered N64. They also had the gold cartridge for Zelda. I think a green cartridge for an Army Man game, if I remember.
Yeah, they started having more fun with the 64. I think WWF No Mercy was in a black shell, and
Yeah.
sports games would come in like blue ones sometimes.
Hmm. I guess to begin to wrap things up, while I try to think of any more questions on my end, are there any aspects when it comes to video game preservation, whether from a digital, physical, or emulation point of view, that we didn't touch on that you would like to bring up now?
No, I think really one of the most important things we talked about was just having that broader discussion, and this is like an industry wide thing between the people making the games and the people enjoying them, is figuring out where the acceptable lines of that are.
Hmm.
When does it go from preservation to just pirating games?
Hmm.
Like figuring out what that is and making that just sort of standard across the board for everybody. And
Hmm.
I think a discussion that needs to happen.
Yeah. Now, here's a question. This one may be a bit too big and could be a very sticky one. But what are your thoughts on the idea of emulating games by pirating copies that just aren't around anymore? Because, again, this is where we get into that very moral gray area.
Yeah, and see that's where I'm saying like
Yeah,
we need to figure out those lines. Like that seems reasonable. If you can't play that game
yeah.
any other way, it's literally impossible to play that game without doing that, then that seems like a reasonable thing to me.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's where I'm at as well. If I legally cannot buy this game and support the developer in any way, shape, or form, then what's the alternative? It's just let the game die, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, it's like yeah, exactly. So I think that the more you move along that it starts getting a little bit messier. And I think that's really where the conversation is going to end up having to go is figuring out where the limitations are.
Hmm. Now, I guess here's my final, I guess, somewhat of a fun question for you, Andrew. But I guess, are there any classic games that you would die to play right now that you can't due to either physical or digital emulation?
Ooh, that's tough because there's not really a lot that you can't do that with.
Hmm.
Like I would have to discover stuff. I feel like it would have to be like some weird PC game that I had never heard of that just looks like it was the greatest thing ever. One thing that I'll never be able to play, I don't think, unless someone released it, was I think it was id made Super Mario Brothers 3. It was either id or Apogee made I think it was Apogee made Super Mario Brothers 3 for the PC to just like show off their awesome scrolling engine. That'd be
Yeah,
really fun to get to play.
nice. Yeah, I know. That's what you were talking about that on Discord as well. Blood got a source port too. I need to
Oh,
play that series at some
did it?
point.
Yeah, it finally got a source port. That's awesome. I've that would there was like a crappy source port for it, I think, or the starts of one that like barely worked. So that was like how I would play it. But that's awesome. That was like real messy for a while because no one knew who owned the rights for that game.
Oh,
So basically, what happened is people were working on a source port, and nobody knew who to sue, or no one knew who was going to sue them. That was it. No one could figure out who should be suing this person, and then and
yeah.
it got like real messy. They tried to like go through official channels, and it was like impossible to find what the official channel was. Like Atari, maybe Warner Brothers, maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to hear that's finally happening because I love that game.
Hmm. And I got one final question that will kind of be our bow to wrap up our discussion on. But before I get to that, for you, Andrew, and for the folks watching or listening to us right now, what's coming next from MegaCat? If you guys have any games to plug or any big announcements.
So we got a couple of cool things in the pipeline. We got I don't know if you've seen any of the press for it or not, but we have an SNES game we're doing with Devolver and the charity group Take This called Fork Parker's Crunch Out. That's going to be coming out on the SNES, so that's pretty exciting. Fork Parker's like Devolver's mascot, and we're making a game about him forcing his forcing his employees to do terrible hours and pointing out how bad that is. So, um, yeah, that's going to be coming out. That's pretty big. And yeah, we got a few events we're going to be going to soon. We're going to be at Too Many Games in Philly this weekend. July 26th, we're going to be doing Replay Effects in Pittsburgh, which is, if you live in Pittsburgh, amazing event. They take our big convention center and turn it into a big arcade. So it's tons of fun. We're going to be at GDEX in Columbus in September, September 28th. And so those a few things we're going to be going to. Looking forward to Too Many Games this weekend. It's going to be a lot of fun.
And unfortunately, I won't be able to make it out. I didn't get a press pass to it, but I'll put one in for next year. Maybe we'll be able to meet up there.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great event, especially if you're into retro stuff. Retro shows are always so much fun because they just have an arcade room.
Oh yeah. When I went out there, I think it was like 2010, maybe a little bit before that. It was a lot of fun. All right. And before I forget, for people who want to follow you and MegaCat, do you have any social media you want to plug?
Yeah, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it. Megacat Studios. All one word on the things. We're like Twitter where it needs to be one word. But yeah, find us as Megacat Studios on there. Go to our website, megacatstudios.com. We got a pretty sweet newsletter that we do on there that you can sign up for, and that's where we have all the games at. You can check them out. We have some demo ROMs of the games if you want to try them before, like if you're trying to decide to buy them or not.
All right. So here's my final question, and I think this is going to be what we'll wrap the cast up with. And keeping with the topic of video game preservation. And I want to get your thoughts on this, because this is one of the common, I think, criticisms that consumers have regarding spending time and money on these older games. And that is, for every Mario, for every Castlevania, there are dozens of crappy games that have been released. You, of course, mentioned Cheetah Man. There are probably more than we could ever count, or more than we can mention right here, of games that just didn't work for one reason or another. So when people argue against game preservation, they say, why should we care about crappy games like that? And I'm going to throw over to you, like, what do you think is the defense for keeping all games supported?
Why should I care about the movie The Room? You know, it's just because something isn't good doesn't mean it's not worth preserving. It doesn't giving people the chance to experience it. I mean, you can learn just as much from a bad game as you can learn from a good one, you know. And you know, there's bad movies are still around. You know, just poorly written books still exist. They're still in print. Yeah, it's if we want to take video game as an art seriously, then we need to preserve as much of it as possible.
Yep, and I agree with you on that. You can learn so much from bad games just as you can from good ones. And as the saying goes, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Got to have some examples of what not to do.
Of course. But I think that is a good point to end our cast on. If you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like 1 minute, Andrew,
yeah, totally.
when we're done. But we will wrap things up here. So, with that said, thank you so much for tuning into our live stream. For those of you watching this live right now, I will be back later tonight for some more game footage. If you're watching this recorded right now and would like to get this discussion earlier and ad-free, please check out patreon.com/GWBycer to get VIP access. But, Andrew, it was great hanging out with you yet again. And again, a really great conversation about game preservation. And once again, definitely best of luck with Megacat. I hope you guys have a great time at Too Many Games.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, man. It was great.
No problem. At some point, we should get James on. We can have everybody on to talk.
Yeah, we'll have to work it out with them. Working out all our schedules is insane, by the way.
I bet it was.
For a bunch of people to work in the same room is a lot of work to get us all to be in the same room.
Great. All right, so with that said, be sure to check out Megacat. And again, the places Andrew mentioned, I'll include them in the description below. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in. Have a great rest of the afternoon, or for those of you watching this recorded. And check back for more discussions on game design and future podcasts where we discuss the art and craft of game design. And before I forget, if you would like to come on for a discussion, we are always looking for new guests. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. But that's it from me. So, Andrew, do you have any final thoughts for the fans to go out on?
Yeah. Keep retro games alive, man. They're important. They're super important. That's it. Just keep them alive. That's it.
All right. Definitely great words to go out on. So, folks, have a great night. I hope you enjoy the cast, and I will be back next time for another discussion. Until then, take care.